I'm the first to say that no theory in Five Nights at Freddy's is confirmed until Scott or a future game confirms it. But this is just such a sure thing that I am continually shocked by the multitudes of people who still believe in competing theories. I talk a lot about personal biases when it comes to weighing evidence or spotting clues, and so I'm completely aware that just because this stuff lines up for me so well, doesn't mean it'll be all that convincing to other people. Basically, I don't think you're stupid or a bad theorist if you disagree. It's just that with this one theory, it seems so close to confirmed that I don't know if Scott could even make it more clear. I believe that multiple things at this point have confirmed that FNaF 3 takes place in 2015. My name is GiBi, welcome to the Horror Homestead. Let's talk about it. This controversy starts on the Steam page description of FNaF 3. It's the third game in the series. We'd previously been spoiled by basically knowing that FNaF 1 takes place in probably the 90s as the heyday of real Chuck E. Cheese, and that FNaF 2 definitely takes place in 1987. The very first FNaF theory that MapPad ever put out narrowed in on the date 1993 as when FNaF 1 happened. Currently, a lot of people think it was either 1992 or 1998, but the point is that we had never been that off on when the series was happening. That ends right now, with the Steam description of FNaF 3. 30 years after Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closed its doors, the events that took place there have become nothing more than a rumor and a childhood memory. But the owners of Fazbear's Fright, the horror attraction, are determined to revive the legend and make the experience as authentic as possible for patrons, going to great lengths to find anything that might have survived decades of neglect and ruin. At first there were only empty shells, a hand, a hook, an old paper plate doll. But then a remarkable discovery was made. The attraction now has one animatronic. The fact of the matter is that this description tells us that FNaF 3 takes place 30 years after Freddy Fazbear's closed its door, and that as simple as we think this sentence is, it's actually anything but. There are two interpretations. Freddy Fazbear's closed its doors refers to any given Freddy Fazbear's location that has closed its doors, or Freddy Fazbear's closed its doors refers to the closing of the final Freddy's location ever to exist, and the dissolving of the company. We know that Freddy's has closed a minimum of 3 times. In 1985, after the missing children's incident, in 1987 after the bite of 87, and sometime in the 90s after FNaF 1. That year used to ubiquitously be believed to be 1993, but now again dates like 92 and 98 are thrown around pretty often, so it could be any of those. I personally believe it's 92, because in FNaF 2 we see that Fazbear employees get paid on Thursdays. We know you get paid on November 12th in FNaF 1, and the only Thursday, November 12th, that fits in the minimum wage range that we know FNaF 1 has, is in 1992. This would also mean that the Friday in FNaF 1 is a Friday the 13th. I do not think that Scott randomly chose dates, nor do I think this is a retcon. I think he always intended FNaF 1 to have a Friday the 13th, and thus for it to be in 1992. If you believe that FNaF 3's description refers to when the last location closed its doors, then that means that FNaF 3 takes place 30 years after FNaF 1, which would put it in 2023, although again, I would say 2022 and some people would say 2028. But for reasons that I'll outline in a moment, the people who believe this theory use circular reasoning to place FNaF 1 in 1993. If you believe that this description means it takes place 30 years after a Freddy's location closed, then it could be 2015, 2017, or 2022, 2023, 2028. I think both interpretations are completely valid, and if this was the only evidence that existed across the franchise, I think the debate still raging to this day would make perfect sense. I think both are basically equally likely. I lean toward the interpretation that it's referring to 30 years after the 85 location closed, but I understand the other perspective. I think this for a few reasons. 30 years after Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closed its doors could mean the location or the company. But I think if Scott meant the company, he would have said Fazbear Entertainment closed its doors, not Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, because the company is called Fazbear Entertainment. The events that took place there have become nothing more than a rumor and a childhood memory. I find it very, very weird to refer to events that took place at multiple restaurants to be referred to as the events that took place there. Like, let's say that disasters struck California and Florida on the same day, and both Disney World and Disneyland were heavily damaged. I don't think anyone would say, "Hey, did you hear about what happened there?" in reference to both Disney parks, because there is singular. It doesn't matter that it's two parks that are Disney. You're still talking about two locations. You wouldn't use the word there to refer to multiple restaurants. Again, let's replace Freddy Fazbear's Pizza with Disney. Let's say that Disneyland closes down, but Disney World is still in operation for a few years before it then too closes down. A headline appears that says, "Disney is closed. Let's reminisce on all of our good memories from there." It would be grammatically incorrect to use that sentence if you're referring to memories from both parks. And we know that Fazbear's Fright isn't only referring to events from one restaurant because they have the toy animatronics. Meaning at the very least, they're pulling from the FNaF 1 location as well as the FNaF 2 location. The owners of Fazbear's Fright, the horror attraction, are determined to revive the legend. Given the heavy implication that staff get hurt at Freddy's all the time, and some of the endings of the week before showing that no one ever looks for Ralph the Phone Guy's body, I think it's pretty clear that Fazbear Entertainment covered up his death. So while the 90s Freddy's location did have deaths, they likely wouldn't be the cause of rumors or legends. Likewise, the 1987 location was only open for 2 weeks, so I wouldn't say it's really possible for there to be a lot of childhood memories that were made there. The location with the childhood memories and the rumors and legends would be the original pizzeria, the one that was open for a long time, was not a smaller budget, rotting, decrepit place like FNaF 1, and actually had the murders take place. That's what a company like Fazbear's Fright would want to replicate and advertise on their horror attraction, so the terms rumors and legends and there point to one singular opening of Freddy's, the MCI location that closed in 1985. FNaF 3 is 30 years after that location closed its doors. With that said, I totally recognize that this is being nitpicky about the word choice of a man who doesn't know what the word convicted means, and keeps on using odd definitions for words like canon and retcon. We're out here analyzing the plural form of words and commas as if Scott has really ever given this stuff much attention. There are multiple typos in the newspapers in the FNaF games. But I think there's other solid reasons to say that FNaF 3 takes place in 2015. If we were having this debate back when the game first came out, I would argue that it fits the theme of the game for it to take place in 2015. 30 years after the final pizzeria closed its doors is 2023, which is a completely random, arbitrary date. The game came out in 2015. I don't know why Scott would decide it takes place 7 years in the future. It's not like there's future technology in the gameplay, it's not like we needed narratively for characters to grow up to fulfill any sort of function. It's actually criticized by the fans that there's this 30-year gap between games when no one is trying to investigate the purple guy. Scott could have made it 25 years later, a nice quarter of a century for the number. Why did he choose 30? In the interpretation that it's 30 years after the MCI, 30 years after the main pizzeria closed its doors in 1985, that would place FNaF 3 in 2015. And that's not arbitrary, that's not a completely random date, that's the year that the game came out. FNaF, the video game series, is all about nostalgia for Chuck E. Cheese, taking childhood memories and trauma and legends about the place and making nostalgic horror entertainment. FNaF as a series is the exact kind of horror attraction that Fazbear's Fright is. It plays up the trauma that people like me who grew up in the 90s have for Chuck E. Cheese animatronics, and now we play a game where those animatronics do come to life and do try to kill you. FNaF coming out in 2014, when I, a 90s kid, was a young adult, was perfect timing to grab that nostalgia, and that's a big reason why the series became so popular in the real world. It might be hard for people who grew up with the series to understand that when it first came out, the adults who were into it because it reminded us of our childhoods. We lived through the time period that the games take place in. Fazbear's Fright, the in-universe horror attraction, plays on the same kind of nostalgia as Five Nights at Freddy's the video game series. And if that's something that Scott was trying to thematically say with the game, then setting it now when the series is being made, now in 2015, when the public is interested in horror stories about Chuck E. Cheese, makes perfect sense. Fazbear's Fright opens in 2015, for the same reason that Five Nights at Freddy's came out in 2014. It's when the public was ready for exactly this kind of entertainment. It also means that the 30-year number that Scott chose isn't arbitrary. He couldn't have just picked 25, because 30 is the number of years between the MCI and today. Like I said earlier, if Scott had never touched this debate again, I would think I'm right, but would understand where other people are coming from. I admit that it's all based on Scott's offhand Steam description. Again, we'd be arguing the semantics of a man who clearly doesn't care. But that's not the end of it, because the timeline keeps referring back to this debate. Critics of the theory that FNaF 3 takes place in 2015 point to the fact that that information can only be reached by adding 30 to the date 1985, which is when the MCI happened and when the original Freddy's was shut down. But that date, 1985, didn't exist until the theorize novel came out, which was after FNaF 3. And yes, that is a huge negative against this theory. Or it would be if it wasn't for the fact that the theorize came out in December of 2015, and FNaF 3 came out in March 2015, meaning the book was definitely being written while this game was in development. Scott would have had the 1985 date locked in by then, if he hadn't come up with it even earlier. There's no reason to think that he wouldn't include this dangling unsolved mystery in one game, knowing that he would leave the answer in another piece of media within months. You can solve FNaF 3's date by buying the theorize novel on sale this Christmas. I'm not going to go as far as to say that the MCI happening in 1985 proves the 2015 date, because that would be circular logic. It could be argued that Scott intended for us to know it's 2015, by thematically looking at the game and determining that it must take place the year it comes out. When the theorize was released later that year and we learned that the MCI was 1985, we could do the math and see that these years are 30 years apart, thus giving us evidence for 2015. But I think that's a stretch, and using that would be circular logic. You're saying that A is true because B is true, and we only know B because A is true, and that's circular logic. We only know 2015 because we know 1985, but we only think to use 1985 because we're assuming 2015, but now we think we know 2015 because of 85. Critics have also said that Scott said that the community solved FNaF 1 through 3, but that's not actually what he said. You know, when I released the first game over a year ago, I was amazed at how quickly everyone found every bit of lore and story. Then the same happened with Part 2. Fans and YouTubers dug in and found everything. Game Theory did an incredible video on Part 2, getting almost everything right. Then Part 3 came out, and once again the story was uncovered by the community. It seemed that there was nothing I could hide. For one, he says that Game Theory got almost everything right, and says for Part 3 that the story was uncovered. At this point, MatPat was still saying that Phone Guy was Purple Guy. If Scott can refer to the false belief that Phone Guy is Purple Guy as almost everything right, then I think there's room in there for him knowing that the community has the wrong date for FNaF 3 to be included in the almost right category. Back when the game first came out, those would be the arguments that people would have in the debate about when the game took place. But since then, there's been more evidence in more recent titles. Before I move on to the pieces of evidence that 100% prove that it's 2015, let's look at what the detractors think the smoking gun for the 2023 date is. HRY223. In FNaF 6, this message from Henry is labeled HRY223. HRY definitely means Henry, and 223 is more up for interpretation, but many people have theorized that it stands for 2023. Since FNaF 6 happens a little bit after FNaF 3, that would seemingly confirm both games take place in 2023. This is problematic for a whole host of reasons. Firstly, it's circular logic. The pieces have nothing backing them up besides each other. They already thought that FNaF 3 was 2023, thus 223 is evidence towards that, but there's no reason to think that 223 means 2023 unless you already believe that it's 2023. The pieces of evidence only back up each other. There's no starting point. If 223 is supposed to be the year, that would be really weird because just using 23 would get the date 2023 across more clearly. Writing 2023 or just 23 would be more clear than 223. No one would name their file 223. If 223 refers to the year, that means that's the only message that Henry recorded in 2023 because two files cannot have the same name. And yet we know that Henry recorded many tapes throughout Pizzeria Simulator. It makes more sense to me that this is recording 223. with the previous tapes, like the sound checks, being HRY 221, HRY 222, and that 223 is just a number that Scott decided on using to show that Henry has been making these logs for a long time. It's not a hint at the date, it's world building for how long Henry has been at this. It's also not completely arbitrary. We know that Scott does do completely arbitrary if you look at Shadow Bonnie's name, Rick Fafaska. I think this gives us a general notion on how long Henry has been at this. We know that some amount of time has passed between FNaF 3 and FNaF 6, maybe it's been 223 days between those games. There's plenty of other things this could mean, and to me, the year makes no sense in-universe, because you can't name multiple files, HRY223, and it seems like a really weird hint to give out of universe. Scott the puzzle maker wouldn't have used 223 to mean 2023, when you could have just used 23. And like I said, it only links back with the FNaF 3 date because of circular logic. There's also the fact that there are people who believe that the Steam page does mean 30 years after FNaF 1, but that FNaF 1 takes place in 1992 or 1998. Those people also have to discount that HRY 223 refers to the year, because they would believe that FNaF 3 takes place in 2028. So that's my rebuttal to the evidence that FNaF 3 is in 2023. But what's my evidence that it's 2015? The security logbook. The security logbook came out in 2017 and is an in-universe book distributed to employees. Beyond the text in the book that is meant for Fazbear employees, there's also things written in the book, specifically red pen written in by Mike Schmidt Afton. Based on evidence within the book, it's theorized that it was made by Fazbear's Fright, although that is just a theory. What can be certain is that the book takes place after the horror attraction is built, as it appears throughout the illustrations. The first night of FNaF 3, Phone Dude says that the guard we play as, who is almost certainly Mike, is back for another night.
Hey, glad you came back for another night.
Meaning that Mike has been a guard there for an indeterminate amount of time before night 1 of FNaF 3. The logbook definitely takes place after Mike's first day at Fazbear's Fright, which is not long before FNaF 3 begins, and then cannot take place after Mike's death on the final night of FNaF 6. So the logbook takes place somewhere between Mike's first day at Fazbear's Fright and Mike's death at the end of FNaF 6. Here's why neither of those dates can be 2023, and also why they're definitely 2015. On page 79, there are some Faz coupons. One of them is a $16 coupon for pizza. The red pen, which remember is Mike's writing, says, "For real value, see page 61. Page 61 features these comics where you're supposed to draw some stuff for Freddy and Foxy to do. On the chalkboard are the numbers 5 plus 4, and then a 3 in the corner, which I think any reasonable math person would interpret as 5 plus 4 times 3, which is 27. So when these coupons were made, they were worth $16. Today's value, today as in the time Mike is writing these notes, it's $27. Taking a page from CandiBuunny's book, I made a spreadsheet of different periods of inflation from when the coupons could possibly have been made to when their values would equal $27. Given the designs on the coupons, they are from no earlier than 1983, which is when the first Freddy's location opened. But before we even get to the math, hang on. If we're using inflation to determine when the book takes place, by taking $16 from the year the coupons were made, trying to hit $27 to find the year the book took place, how could the book take place in 2023 if it was released in 2017? It can't. Mike literally cannot die after 2017, because he references inflation in a book that was published in 2017. Scott does not know inflation rates for the future. This one section means that no matter what, Mike does not die after 2017. It would be physically impossible. I say can't, but you could just say that these numbers aren't supposed to get you to 27, or that Mike's words aren't talking about inflation. That would allow you to discount everything I just said. But I think it's pretty clear that's what's being implied here. That's what I meant when I said in the beginning that what's obvious evidence for one person, someone else can brush off. So with that disclaimer, let's do the math. As you can see, we actually stop in 1994, because after 1994, there's no point in which inflation causes $16 to become $27 until after the book was published. If the coupons are from 1992, which is the date that I think FNaF 1 takes place in, then it hits $27 in 2014. It's still $27 in 2015 and 2016. If the coupons are from 1993, which is when the community seems to think FNaF 1 takes place, Then it hits $27 in 2017. Since Mike's red pen says, "For real value, see page 61," and the book was published in 2017, I could see people interpreting this as 2017 being the year the book takes place. So this would still allow FNAF 1 to take place in 93. It would just mean that the book takes place in 2017. Remember, the book isn't giving us the year of FNAF 3, it's just giving us the bounds between the beginning of FNAF 3 and the end of FNAF 6. I'm now going to try to address some more branches of thought that could come from these pieces of evidence, as well as look into some of the more out-there theories and interpretations of what this evidence might mean. Despite the bombastic title of this video, I do think it's possible that the code in the security logbook is referring to the book taking place in 2017. If FNAF 1 happens in 93, then all of the inflation math does point to the book taking place in 2017, which is a valid interpretation of Mike saying real value. If the logbook is 2017, that still means that FNAF 3 can take place anytime before 2017. We know that Fazbear Frights had to exist as a physical location before it could be drawn in the book. So while this does technically allow FNAF 3 to happen in 2017, it still rules out 2023 as a possible date. I do feel like I have to mention that if FNAF 3 takes place in 2017, that would be 30 years after the FNAF 2 location closed its doors in 1987. No one really argues for that interpretation of the Steam page, but I do need to point out that there is some evidence that FNAF 3 takes place 30 years after FNAF 2. Many timeline theories, including my own, believe that the spring locking incident happened between FNAF 2 and FNAF 1. Shortly after the FNAF 2 location closed, the animatronics were brought to what would become the FNAF 1 location. William breaks in and gets spring-locked in the back. That places his spring locking probably in 1987, which could mean that he was intended to be spring-locked for exactly 30 years. Just some food for thought, which actually does make a little sense, given that FNAF 3 is obviously the sequel to FNAF 2. In the Fazbear Frights book, What We Found, a character goes through some of the events of FNAF 3. It's more of a parallel, if anything. The character in that book is directly stated to be 23 years old, which some have interpreted to be confirmation as to the theory that the game takes place in 2023. And while I do see that connection, I think it's equally, if not more likely, that that's just a number. Scott said in his second interview with Dawko that there are so many characters in the books that sometimes things just line up. The character in the story in the flesh is named Matt, and Scott confirmed that that's not a reference to MatPat. As Mr. Hippo says, sometimes a story is just a story, and sometimes an age is just an age. It goes back to my point about HRY 223. If we didn't already think that FNAF 3 took place in 2023, would we view this character's age as evidence for that theory? Why don't we look at arbitrary things like that in other stories as evidence for other theories? Is it confirmation bias? Some people think that while it's possible that Scott intended certain dates while making the games, he's since moved them around as the community came to its consensus. For example, he originally just planned FNAF to take place sometime in the 90s, and then later settled on 93 when that's what the community came to agree upon. I disagree with that for two reasons. One, I really think that FNAF 1 being in 92 was the original intention because it has a Friday the 13th. No one really talks about it, but I don't know why FNAF takes place in November when October is obviously the better pick. I can see Scott knowing that he wants the game to take place in the early 90s, and he wants to find a date that fits that time period that also has a Friday the 13th. And so he's stuck with November of 1992. And two, even if Scott did shift some dates around, I don't think FNAF 3 would be one of them. I don't think he would shift if he originally meant FNAF 3 to take place 30 years after the MCI, for it to instead take place 30 years after FNAF 1. That's a shift of the intention of his storytelling, not a shift of numbers. I've received some comments from people stating that Scott confirmed that FNAF 1 takes place in 1993. This is not true. The only evidence of the 93 date comes from unreleased non-canon messages in the files for FNAF AR that allude to the 93 date. Unreleased text in a questionably canon game not developed by Scott in an era that Scott specifically said he had issues with communication between him and game devs is not good evidence. If Steel Wool can make the burn trap ending of Security Breach outside of Scott's eye, in complete conflict with Scott's intention for the series, that later had to be retconned out of canon, then unused text in the AR spin-off mobile game should not be looked at as evidence. He even said at one point that he went an entire year without speaking to the developers of Into the Pit. I really don't think we can look at the unreleased emails in FNaF AR as confirmation of Scott's intention. Some people might think that HRY223 can refer to February of 2023, which fixes some of my issue with naming files, although it still means he only made one audio log for that entire month. My issue with this is that elsewhere in the game, FNaF 6 indicates that it's probably taking place in the fall. There's a poster for Spooky Fest outside in the alleyway. When it comes to Scott the puzzle maker, I find it hard to imagine that his plan would go something to the effect of, "Aha, you thought it was fall because I put a jack-o'-lantern poster on the wall. But it's actually February, because HRY223 obviously means February 23rd and there's nothing else it could possibly mean. I intended on you to figure this out." When you look at the puzzles that Scott makes, he usually makes the solution very clear once you've reached it. Getting Dave's name from the logbook wasn't just about finding letters that are an anagram or a scramble of the name Dave. It was Dave, exactly backwards, across from a picture of a mirror. A backwards name across from a mirror is more confirmation than just a name. It's why Evan was never satisfying as a name for the crying child. The mirror being across from Dave in reverse is that extra check mark that we did it right. I don't see the connection between HRY223 in reference to the year the game took place. I don't see that as the check mark to FNaF 3 and FNaF 6 taking place that year, simply because you don't typically name files years. That's not a check mark, it's just a random floating data point that people have linked. Continuing the topic of HRY223, if you look closely at that section of FNaF 6, you actually see that the text on screen says, "Playing audio file HRY223... ... generally means two things. It could mean that something is loading, like the equivalent of a spinning wheel as a video or a web page loads. This is typically from older computers, which could mean that it's thinking while playing the audio file. Basically, it's going to have those dots there until the audio file ends. Or it could mean that the name of the file is longer than it can display. It's longer than 6 characters. The file could be named HRY2234802YHNG0894 and it would still be displayed as HRY223... That could further indicate that the numbers are arbitrary. Here's the thing. I think it would be absolutely wild to see that 30 years after 1985 is 2015, which is a valid interpretation of the description no matter what you believe. See that the inflation from 1992 to 2015 makes $16 into $27, and think that this is a coincidence. If you don't think that Mike's writing is implying inflation, or you don't think that the numbers on the Foxy Freddy comic page are supposed to get you to 27, then you have to admit it is a crazy coincidence that these numbers add up in this way. If the day we get paid in FNaF 2 and FNaF 1 do not mean that FNaF 1 takes place in 1992, if the description of FNaF 3 on Steam does not mean it takes place 30 years after the MCI location closed its doors in 2015, if Mike isn't referencing inflation when he says real value, if the numbers on the chalkboard aren't meant to be added up and multiplied to get 27, then it is completely insane that all those factors line up exactly to make $16 in 1992 equal $27 in 2015. This is important because it actually has bearing on the Pizzaplex era of the story. The year that Security Breach takes place in has been determined to be either 2029, 2035, 2046, 2057, and there's some other ones further in the future, due to calendars that are shown in the Pizzaplex. Knowing that the Pizzaplex has been around for about 5 years, people have ruled out the 2029 date, because having the Pizzaplex open in 2024 would be too close to FNaF 6 happening in 2023. The thing is that if FNaF 3 and FNaF 6 don't take place in 2023, if they take place in 2015, which is what I believe, then that opens up 2029 as being the year that Security Breach takes place in. This almost decade-long debate about when FNaF 3 happens, and the community consensus that it's 2023, could be leading us down the wrong path to trying to figure out Security Breach if we limit ourselves to thinking it must take place in 2035. What does matter is that FNaF 3 takes place in 2015, and I find it really hard to believe that there's any other option here. It really comes down to this. If HRY223 didn't exist, would you still believe that FNaF 3 took place in 2023 just based on the Steam page? And the answer is maybe, but without anything really there to back it up. If the Steam page didn't exist, and the only thing that existed was HRY223, would you believe that that implied that FNaF 3 and 6 took place in 2023? I don't think anybody would really have made that leap. If the logbook didn't exist, would I think that the Steam page implied 2015? Well, yes, because again it fits along with the theme of the game. If the Steam page didn't exist, would I think the game took place in 2015 just with the logbook? Yes, absolutely. These two things aren't contingent on each other to be evidence. That's what I mean by circular logic. HRY223 and the assumption that the Steam page implies 2023 are dependent on each other, whereas the Steam page and the theme of the game implying 2015 and the logbook are independent branches of evidence that happen to combine to reach the same conclusion. And I really don't know what anyone would say to counter the things that I pointed out in this video. The answer wasn't backwards engineered from future titles, it was theorized and then later confirmed. If you still believe FNaF 3 is in 2023, I'd love to hear the counter to the evidence that I laid out in this video, and also the counters to my counters. How could Scott know inflation for the future, and why would the numbers line up so perfectly? Unless you don't think that the chalkboard gets us the number 27, in which case, why do you think Mike tells us to go to this page? And if you do agree that it's 27, you still might not believe that Mike is referring to inflation. If you don't think he is, then what is he referring to? If Henry's message was not named 223 in FNaF 6, would you still think that FNaF 3 took place in 2023 based on the Steam page alone, even in light of this other information? If yes, why is that interpretation of the Steam page more convincing than all of the counter evidence? If no, are you open to the argument that 223 could mean something else? How could Henry's log be titled after the year if he has multiple log files? Why is it more likely that he's naming his file 223 after the year 2023, as opposed to it being the 223rd recording? Why did Scott pick a day 7 years in the future when making FNaF 3? Why did Scott pick exactly 30 years? The reason I made this video is because Hyperdroid put out his 24-hour FNaF Encyclopedia video, which is amazing and you should absolutely watch it. I'm only about halfway through, but it's incredible so far. And he touched on this subject, but he got it backwards, saying that the logbook must mean that FNaF 3 is after 2017, instead of before 2017. He actually says this twice. This means that he's seen the evidence, but misunderstands it.
And he'd also later create a code in the survival logbook that makes FNaF 3 taking place before 2017 extremely unlikely, to the point some say impossible.
The graphic shown on screen highlights Mike's comment referring to the chalkboard page and adds that up to get 27. It finds inflation of $16 in 1993 would be about $27 in 2017, pointing out that's when the book came out, and states, logbook takes place in modern times. Along the bottom it says, Scott can't make the code equal 2023's actual value of the $16 because that would be predicting the future and he would get it wrong. However, making it equal today's value at the time makes us aware it's in modern times. This graphic that Hyperdroid puts on screen argues the same thing that I've been arguing this entire video. However, for some reason he states that it actually proves the opposite. Once again, stating,
code in the survival logbook that makes FNaF 3 taking place before 2017 extremely unlikely, to the point some say impossible.
Which gives me hope that having the information laid out like this may convince people who got lost in the numbers and weren't convinced the first time of what I believe to be the only actual conclusion. There are lots of things in FNaF that people get worked up over. As I always say, Freddy stands for friendly, respectful engagement, discussion, and discourse yield success. So while this is probably my strongest line in the sand, I want to make it clear that I don't put my emotional stake invested in this theory being correct. I'm not here to start fights or arguments. This is the funny scare bear game. This video is me putting my best foot forward on arguing something that, for whatever reason, the community consensus does not currently believe. Unlike theories about Midnight Motorist and the identity of Mrs. Afton, I don't think that this is something fun to speculate about. I think this is something that we have a solid answer to, and it just kind of confuses me that other people don't see it that way. So leave your thoughts in the comments, remember to be nice to each other, consider supporting the creators you admire, you can support me on Patreon, linked below, you can visit my merch store, I got shirts for the funny scare bear game. I would also like to thank CandiBuunny, who helped look over this video for anything I may have missed or left out. And most importantly, remember not to lose sight of the things that are actually important to you.